The British Crown generated more revenue from illegal drugs than Microsoft makes from Windows today. By 1839, Britain controlled the largest narcotics operation in human history, worth $284 billion in today's money. They didn't hide in shadows or operate through criminal networks. They did it openly, with Royal Navy warships, government officials, and the full backing of Parliament. Their target? The most powerful empire on Earth, China. But what nobody talks about is how this wasn't just about getting Chinese people addicted to opium. This was the blueprint for modern economic warfare, the world's first systematic campaign to destroy a rival economy using controlled substances. The British didn't just want China's silver and silk, they wanted to break China's 4,000-year streak as the world's dominant civilization. Here's what makes this story absolutely insane. The British Crown, the same institution that preached Christian morality across its empire, became history's largest drug cartel. They grew opium in India, smuggled it into China through British-controlled networks, and when the Chinese government tried to stop them, Britain declared war. Twice. We're talking about a government operation so profitable that it funded the Industrial Revolution, built the modern British Navy, and established London as the financial capital of the world. The East India Company, Britain's corporate front for this operation, generated more annual profit from opium than the GDP of most European nations. The Chinese called it the foreign mud that destroys souls. British merchants called it God's own medicine. Politicians in London called it free trade. But the numbers tell the real story. Between 1820 and 1840, British opium imports created approximately 12 million Chinese addicts, roughly 4% of China's entire population, hooked on a drug that Britain grew, processed, and distributed. This is the story of how a small island nation off the coast of Europe used systematic drug trafficking to topple the world's oldest continuous civilization, how they turned addiction into imperial policy, and how the profits from poisoning millions of people built the foundation of the modern global economy. What happened next would reshape the world order forever, create the template for economic imperialism that's still used today, and prove that sometimes the biggest criminals wear crowns instead of masks. By 1840, Britain had accomplished something unprecedented in world history. They had turned an entire nation into their customer base for illegal narcotics. Not a small nation, China, home to 1/3 of all humans on Earth. But to understand how a Christian empire became the world's premier drug dealer, we need to rewind to 1757, when Britain first realized they had a China problem. Picture this. You're a British merchant in the 1750s and you want Chinese silk, porcelain, and tea. Everyone in Europe wants these luxuries. There's just one catch. The Chinese don't want anything you have. They're completely self-sufficient. They have better manufacturing, superior agriculture, and more advanced technology. When European traders show up with wool, metals, or manufactured goods, Chinese officials politely decline. "We have everything we need," they say. "You can pay in silver." This created what economists call a trade imbalance, but that's a boring way to describe Britain's nightmare. Every year, massive amounts of silver flowed from British coffers to Chinese treasuries. British merchants were literally bleeding money to access Chinese goods, and there was nothing they could offer in return. The Chinese weren't being difficult, they were being logical. Why would you trade your superior products for inferior ones? China in 1750 was the workshop of the world. They produced everything better and cheaper than anyone else. They had mastered steel production 1,000 years before Europe figured it out. They invented gunpowder, printing, paper money, and the compass. From their perspective, Europeans were barbarians with nothing to offer. Britain tried everything. They offered British manufactured goods. Chinese craftsmen laughed. They brought European art and scientific instruments. The Chinese already had better versions. They even tried selling British culture and Christianity. The Chinese emperor famously replied that China possesses all things in prolific abundance and lacks no product within its borders. Meanwhile, Britain's economy was transforming. The Industrial Revolution was beginning. Textile mills were humming and the British Empire was expanding across the globe. But all of this growth depended on Chinese goods. British ladies demanded Chinese silk. British gentlemen required Chinese tea. British factories needed Chinese raw materials, and every purchase drained silver from the British treasury into Chinese vaults. The East India Company, Britain's corporate arm in Asia, was hemorrhaging money. They controlled massive territories in India, ran their own armies, and collected taxes like a government. But their Chinese operations were a financial disaster. They were essentially an advanced ATM machine for the Chinese Empire. By 1770, company officials were getting desperate. They needed something, anything that Chinese people would buy, something that could reverse the flow of silver and make Britain the supplier instead of the customer. That's when they discovered something interesting in the hills of Bengal, India. Local farmers had been growing poppy flowers for centuries, harvesting opium for medical purposes. Small scale, traditional, nothing significant. But British agricultural experts realized something the local farmers hadn't. These Bengal poppies could produce opium more potent and addictive than anything grown elsewhere. Even better, they learned that some Chinese people, mainly poor laborers and soldiers, were already smoking small amounts of opium recreationally. It wasn't widespread, and the Chinese government had actually banned it decades earlier, recognizing its dangers. But there was a market. British officials saw an opportunity, not just to sell a product to China, but to create demand where none existed before. They could grow opium in British-controlled India, process it using British-supervised techniques, ship it on British vessels, and sell it through British networks. For the first time, they would control the entire supply chain of something Chinese people wanted. The moral implications were obvious. Opium was dangerous, addictive, and banned by Chinese law. Selling it meant defying a sovereign government, creating addiction among their population, and potentially destabilizing their society. British officials knew this. Their own medical experts had warned about opium's effects, but the financial implications were irresistible. Instead of silver flowing from Britain to China, they could create a system where silver flowed from China to Britain. Instead of being China's customer, Britain could become China's supplier. Instead of begging Chinese merchants for favorable trade terms, British merchants could dictate terms to Chinese addicts. The East India Company made a decision that would reshape world history. They would transform their Indian territories into the world's largest narcotics production facility. They would create an addiction epidemic in China to solve Britain's trade deficit. They would use the Royal Navy to protect drug shipments and the British government to legitimize drug profits. This wasn't just about commerce. This was about power. For 4,000 years, China had been the world's dominant civilization. They had survived invasions, natural disasters, and internal revolutions while maintaining their position as humanity's most advanced society. But Britain was about to prove that no empire, however ancient or powerful, could survive systematic addiction of its population. What happened next would create history's most profitable criminal enterprise, establish the template for modern economic warfare, and prove that sometimes the most effective weapon isn't military force. It's a drug that makes people destroy themselves. Chapter 1. Trading Company. The East India Company wasn't supposed to become history's largest drug cartel. When British merchants received their royal charter from Queen Elizabeth I in 1600, they had legitimate goals: import spices, establish trading posts, compete with Dutch merchants in Asian markets. But by 1757, something had changed. The company didn't just trade anymore, they ruled. They controlled territories larger than Britain itself, commanded armies bigger than the Royal Navy, and collected taxes from 60 million people. They had evolved from a trading corporation into a shadow empire, accountable to no government except their own shareholders. The transformation happened gradually, then suddenly. British merchants arrived in India as supplicants, begging local rulers for permission to establish small trading posts. They offered gifts, followed local customs, and accepted subordinate status. Just another group of foreign merchants seeking profit in the rich markets of Asia. What changed everything was the Battle of Plassey in 1757. Robert Clive, a company clerk turned military commander, defeated the Nawab of Bengal through a combination of superior tactics and strategic bribery. Suddenly, the East India Company controlled Bengal, the richest province in India. home to more people than Britain itself. Clive himself described what happened next. A great prince was dependent on my pleasure. An opulent city lay at my mercy. Its richest bankers bid against each other for my smiles. The company had discovered something more profitable than trade: taxation. Why negotiate with local rulers when you could become the local ruler? The British transformed Bengal into a revenue machine. They collected land taxes, controlled salt production, and monopolized key industries. Most importantly, they gained control of Bengal's agricultural system, including those poppy fields that local farmers had used for small-scale opium production. British agricultural experts immediately recognized the potential. Bengal's climate and soil produced opium of exceptional quality. The traditional cultivation methods could be scaled up dramatically. And unlike other crops that required complex international markets, opium had one obvious destination: China. The company established what they called the Opium Department in 1773. They offered Bengali farmers advance payments to grow poppies instead of food crops. They built processing facilities to refine raw opium into smokable form. They created a quality control system to ensure consistent potency. Within a decade, Bengal was producing 4,000 chests of opium annually, each chest containing 140 pounds of refined narcotic. But here's what made the operation brilliant from a business perspective. The East India Company maintained plausible deniability. Officially, they didn't sell opium to China. That would be illegal under Chinese law. Instead, they auctioned the opium to independent traders in Calcutta, who then transported it to China through private networks. These independent traders were actually company employees, former company officials, or British merchants operating under company protection. The auction system was a legal fiction. Everyone understood that the company controlled the entire operation while maintaining the appearance of arm's-length transactions. Warren Hastings, the company's Governor-General, justified the system in his correspondence with London. "It is not for the sake of the revenue that we permit the cultivation of opium, but for the sake of our commercial interests in China." He was lying, of course. The revenue was massive and growing every year. The numbers tell the real story. By 1790, opium sales generated 7.5 million rupees annually for the company, roughly equivalent to $500 million today. This represented 15% of the company's total revenue from India, more than they earned from textile exports, salt taxes, or land revenue from many provinces. More importantly, opium solved the China trade problem. For the first time since Europeans began trading with China, Britain had a product that Chinese people actually wanted to buy. The silver that had flowed eastward for centuries began flowing westward. British merchants in Canton started reporting remarkable changes. Chinese customers who had previously demanded silver payment were now offering silver to purchase opium. The drug created its own demand. Users needed regular supplies, and addiction ensured customer loyalty better than any marketing campaign. The East India Company scaled up accordingly. They expanded poppy cultivation across Bengal, improved processing techniques, and established regular shipping schedules to China. They created what business historians now recognize as the world's first modern international drug trafficking network, complete with cultivation zones, processing facilities, distribution networks, and financial systems. The moral implications troubled some company officials. David Scott, a company director, wrote privately, "It is a subject I do not like to dwell upon, but I fear we are deeply responsible for the misery inflicted upon the Chinese people." But such concerns never translated into policy changes. The profits were too large, and the China trade was too important. The company also recognized that their opium operation needed political protection. Chinese officials would inevitably try to stop the trade, and British merchants would need government backing to continue operations. The East India Company began lobbying Parliament and the Crown for official support of what they euphemistically called free trade with China. They argued that Chinese attempts to ban opium violated principles of international commerce. They claimed that Britain had a right to sell any legal product, conveniently ignoring the fact that opium was illegal under Chinese law. They positioned themselves as defenders of British commercial interests against Chinese protectionism. By 1800, The East India Company had created an integrated narcotics empire spanning 2 continents. They controlled cultivation in India, shipping routes across the Indian Ocean, and distribution networks in China. They had turned opium from a minor agricultural product into the foundation of Britain's Asian commerce. The company's transformation from legitimate trading corporation to drug trafficking organization was complete. They had discovered that addiction was the most reliable business model in human history. Customers never stopped needing your product, demand increased over time, and users paid any price you demanded. But this was just the beginning. The East India Company had created the supply chain and distribution network. Now they needed to scale up production and create mass addiction in China itself. They had proven that drug trafficking could be profitable. Next, they would prove it could be imperial policy. The Chinese government had no idea what was coming. They were about to face something unprecedented in their 4,000-year history. An enemy that attacked not with armies or weapons, but with a substance that turned their own people against themselves. Chapter 2. Chinese Wall. The Qing dynasty controlled the largest empire in human history. In 1800, China's population approached 300 million, more people than all of Europe combined. They had the world's most advanced agriculture, sophisticated manufacturing, and efficient government bureaucracy. For 2 millennia, China had been civilization's crown jewel. Foreign tribute missions came to Beijing from across Asia, acknowledging Chinese supremacy. But Chinese officials had noticed something troubling in their southern provinces. Reports filtered in from Canton, Macau, and other coastal cities about a new social problem. Foreign merchants were selling something called foreign mud that made people sick, lazy, and desperate. The foreign mud was opium, and its effects were becoming impossible to ignore. Chinese users would lie motionless for hours, neglecting work, family, and social obligations. They spent increasing amounts of money on the drug, often selling possessions, borrowing heavily, or stealing to fund their addiction. Worse, the addiction seemed permanent. Users rarely recovered even when they wanted to quit. Emperor Jiaqing received increasingly alarmed reports from provincial governors. In Fujian province, officials counted 30,000 opium users in a single district. In Guangdong, the problem had spread from poor laborers to merchants, students, and even government clerks. Most disturbing, young people were becoming addicted faster and more severely than older users. The Chinese government response was swift and comprehensive. In 1729, Emperor Yongzheng had already banned opium smoking and sales. His successors strengthened these laws repeatedly, adding penalties for cultivation, processing, and distribution. By 1800, Chinese law prescribed death for opium trafficking and severe punishment for use. But enforcement proved nearly impossible. Chinese officials discovered they were fighting something unprecedented: a criminal network backed by foreign military power, unlimited financial resources, and sophisticated corruption techniques. British opium merchants had learned to exploit every weakness in Chinese governance. They established fortified positions on coastal islands outside direct Chinese control. They bribed local officials, creating networks of corrupt magistrates who ignored trafficking in exchange for personal payments. They used fast ships and armed escorts to outrun Chinese patrol vessels. Most importantly, they had discovered that opium created its own protection network. Addicted Chinese officials became unwilling allies, protecting trafficking routes to ensure their personal supply. Addicted merchants provided smuggling services. Addicted workers unloaded ships and transported cargo. The drug literally converted Chinese citizens into British assets. Commissioner Lin Zexu became the Chinese official most determined to solve the opium crisis. Appointed by Emperor Daoguang in 1838, Lin was known for his incorruptibility, intelligence, and administrative skill. He understood that China faced not just a criminal problem, but an existential threat. Lin spent months studying the opium trade before taking action. He interviewed recovering addicts, examined British shipping records, and calculated the economic impact of drug imports. His findings were staggering. China was importing 40,000 chests of opium annually, representing 5.6 million pounds of narcotic. British merchants were earning profits equivalent to China's entire annual tax revenue from a single product. More disturbing, Lin realized the trade was accelerating. British cultivation in India was expanding rapidly, new distribution networks were forming, and addiction rates were rising exponentially. At current growth rates, Lin calculated that 10% of China's population would be addicted within 2 decades. Lin also discovered something that shocked even him. The opium trade was reversing China's traditional trade surplus. For centuries, China had exported more than it imported, accumulating global silver reserves. But opium purchases were draining Chinese silver so rapidly that the empire faced potential monetary crisis. The numbers were devastating. Between 1800 and 1838, China had spent approximately 100 million silver taels on opium imports, equivalent to $7 billion today. This silver came directly from China's treasury, provincial tax receipts, and private savings. The entire Chinese economy was being restructured to fund British drug profits. Lin wrote directly to Queen Victoria, appealing to her moral sensibilities. "Your country lies 20,000 li away, but for all that the way of heaven holds good for you as for us, and your instincts are not different from ours. For nowhere are there men so blind as not to distinguish between what brings profit and what does harm." Lin's letter was never answered. British officials understood perfectly well the harm their trade was causing. They simply didn't care. The profits were too large, and China's weakness created opportunity for further exploitation. But Lin wasn't just writing letters. He was preparing the most comprehensive anti-drug campaign in Chinese history. Working with loyal officials across southern China, Lin created an enforcement network capable of intercepting British shipments, arresting Chinese collaborators, and destroying opium stocks. In March 1839, Lin arrived in Canton with emergency powers from the emperor. He immediately surrounded the foreign trading quarter and demanded that British merchants surrender their opium stocks. All of them. Not just current inventory, but signed pledges never to import opium again. British merchants were incredulous. They had operated freely in Chinese waters for decades, bribing officials and ignoring Chinese law with impunity. Now, a Chinese official was actually demanding compliance with Chinese law in Chinese territory. The audacity was unprecedented. Lin gave them 3 days to comply. When they refused, he cut off all food supplies to the foreign quarter and detained British merchants until they surrendered their opium. He wasn't negotiating. He was enforcing Chinese sovereignty in Chinese territory. The siege lasted 6 weeks. British merchants initially assumed their government would protect them, but no rescue came. They were isolated, running out of supplies, and facing increasingly angry Chinese crowds. Finally, they capitulated. The surrender was total. British merchants handed over 20,283 chests of opium, 2.6 million pounds of refined narcotic worth $30 million at contemporary prices, equivalent to 900 million today. Lin had confiscated the largest drug seizure in human history, but confiscation was only the beginning. Lin ordered the opium destroyed in a manner that would prevent any possibility of recovery or resale. Chinese workers mixed the opium with salt and lime, then flushed the mixture into the Pearl River. The destruction took 23 days, with crowds watching the foreign poison dissolve into harmless sludge. Lin sent detailed reports to Beijing describing the operation's success. He had eliminated the British opium stockpile, arrested key Chinese collaborators, and demonstrated that foreign merchants could not operate above Chinese law. The opium crisis appeared solved, but Lin had made a critical miscalculation. He had treated British drug trafficking as a law enforcement problem when it was actually an imperial strategy. The British weren't just merchants seeking profit. They were the advance guard of an empire seeking dominance. Lin's success in Canton was about to trigger something he never anticipated. The British government would use his enforcement of Chinese law as justification for military invasion of China itself. They would claim that Chinese attempts to stop British drug trafficking violated principles of international trade and justified armed retaliation. The most powerful empire in Chinese history was about to discover that fighting drug traffickers, backed by the Royal Navy, required more than moral authority and administrative efficiency. They needed something they didn't have: the willingness to match British ruthlessness with Chinese brutality. The Opium Wars were about to begin. Chapter 3: Forbidden Cargo. Charles Eliot received the news in November 1839. Chinese officials had seized and destroyed 20,283 chests of British opium worth millions of pounds. As Britain's chief superintendent of trade in China, Eliot faced a decision that would reshape world history. He could accept Chinese law enforcement as legitimate and negotiate compensation for destroyed contraband. This would acknowledge China's sovereignty over its own territory and end the opium trade permanently. Or he could frame Chinese drug enforcement as an act of war against British commercial interests, justifying military retaliation. Eliot chose war. His reasoning was carefully crafted for audiences back in London. Chinese authorities hadn't just seized illegal drugs, they had violated British property rights and imprisoned British subjects. Never mind that the property was illegal under Chinese law and the subjects were imprisoned for drug trafficking. Eliot positioned China's law enforcement as aggression against Britain itself. The argument worked because it aligned with broader British imperial strategy. The East India Company had spent decades building their opium operation, investing millions in cultivation, processing, and distribution networks. Company shareholders expected profits, not Chinese interference with their business model. More importantly, British officials recognized that the opium trade represented something bigger than drug profits. This was about establishing dominance over China's massive economy. If China could successfully ban British imports, they might ban other British products or even exclude British merchants entirely. The opium trade was a test case for British economic penetration of Chinese markets. Foreign Secretary Lord Palmerston received Eliot's dispatches in London and immediately grasped the strategic implications. China wasn't just challenging British drug trafficking, they were challenging British imperial expansion in Asia. If Britain accepted Chinese authority over trade, other Asian powers might follow China's example and restrict British commerce. Palmerston drafted Britain's official response to Commissioner Lin's opium seizure. The British government cannot allow its subjects to be treated with such violence and injustice without seeking satisfaction. The language was deliberately misleading. British subjects had been treated according to Chinese law for violating Chinese drug prohibitions in Chinese territory. But Palmerston's real strategy was more sophisticated. He positioned the conflict as about free trade rather than drug trafficking. British merchants, he argued, should be free to sell any legal product in international markets. Chinese attempts to ban specific imports violated principles of international commerce. The argument had one obvious flaw. Opium wasn't a legal product under Chinese law, but Palmerston solved this by arguing that Chinese law itself was invalid. China couldn't ban imports because such bans violated natural principles of free trade that superseded local legislation. This legal theory that British commercial interests superseded Chinese sovereignty became the intellectual foundation for military action. Parliament debated whether to support armed intervention in China, with Palmerston arguing that Chinese outrages against British commerce justified defensive war. The parliamentary debate revealed the moral contradiction at the heart of British policy. William Gladstone, then a young MP, pointed out the obvious. We are carrying on a war to maintain the traffic in a drug which the Chinese government has declared to be pernicious and which we ourselves prohibit the use of in our own dominions. Gladstone was exactly right. Opium was banned in Britain itself. The government recognized its dangers for British citizens, but demanded the right to sell it to Chinese citizens. British law prohibited opium use by British people, while British policy required opium access for Chinese people. But moral arguments couldn't compete with economic ones. The East India Company had calculated that their Chinese operations generated $3.7 million annually, equivalent to $400 million today. This revenue-funded company operations across Asia supported thousands of British jobs and contributed significantly to British tax receipts. More importantly, the opium trade had solved Britain's fundamental problem with Chinese commerce. Before opium, Britain hemorrhaged silver buying Chinese products they couldn't reciprocate. After opium, Chinese silver flowed to Britain buying British-controlled narcotics. The drug trade had reversed the entire economic relationship. Parliament voted 271 to 262 to support military action against China. The narrow margin reflected genuine moral concerns about Britain's first explicitly drug-motivated war, But the majority recognized that backing down would end Britain's most profitable Asian operation and establish a precedent for Chinese resistance to British commerce. The Royal Navy immediately began assembling what they called the China Expeditionary Force: 16 warships, 4,000 Marines, and state-of-the-art military technology, including the new iron-hulled steamer Nemesis, the first iron warship to see combat. British military planners understood they possessed overwhelming technological advantages. Chinese naval forces relied on traditional wooden junks and outdated artillery. Chinese coastal fortifications were designed for historical threats, not modern naval bombardment. British forces could attack anywhere along China's massive coastline, while Chinese forces had to defend everywhere simultaneously. But technology wasn't Britain's only advantage. The opium trade had created intelligence networks throughout coastal China. Addicted officials provided information about Chinese military preparations. Chinese smugglers offered detailed knowledge of harbors, currents, and defensive positions. The drug network became a spy network. British commanders also recognized that opium addiction had weakened Chinese military effectiveness. Reports from Canton described Chinese soldiers too intoxicated to perform duties, officers selling military supplies to fund drug purchases, and entire units becoming unreliable during crisis situations. Captain Charles Elliot, now commanding British naval forces, received explicit instructions from London: reopen the opium trade, secure compensation for destroyed drugs, and establish permanent British rights to Chinese markets. The war wasn't about punishing Chinese aggression. It was about establishing British commercial dominance. The first engagement came at Chwenpi in January 1841. British warships bombarded Chinese fortifications, while Chinese return fire bounced harmlessly off British iron hulls. The technological gap was so vast that Chinese defenders began calling British ships devil vessels, immune to conventional weapons. Within hours, British forces had destroyed fortifications that had protected Chinese territory for centuries. The Nemesis, powered by steam engines and armed with modern artillery, single-handedly eliminated an entire Chinese fleet. Chinese military resistance collapsed not through cowardice, but through technological obsolescence. But British strategy went beyond military victory. They targeted China's economic infrastructure, blockading major ports and disrupting trade routes. The goal was demonstrating that Chinese prosperity depended on British goodwill, resist British commerce, and face economic strangulation. The strategy worked perfectly. Chinese merchants who had supported Commissioner Lin's anti-opium campaign began pressuring the government for compromise. They needed access to international markets more than they needed to stop drug trafficking. Economic warfare proved more effective than military campaigns. Commissioner Lin, watching his anti-drug campaign collapse under British bombardment, wrote bitterly to Beijing, "The English barbarians have shown their true nature. They care nothing for justice, morality, or the welfare of our people. They desire only profit and will use force to secure it." Lin was absolutely correct, but his analysis came too late. The British had demonstrated something that would reshape international relations. A technologically superior power could impose its economic preferences through military force, regardless of local law, sovereignty, or moral considerations. The Opium Wars established the template for modern economic imperialism. Identify a profitable market, create demand for your products, use legal and diplomatic pressure to secure access. When local authorities resist, frame their resistance as aggression against your legitimate interests. Finally, use military force to impose your preferred trade terms. The Chinese were learning a painful lesson that would echo through the next century. In the modern world, military technology determined commercial rights. Britain's ability to destroy Chinese defenses gave them the right to poison Chinese citizens. Superior firepower trumped moral authority, legal sovereignty, and even basic human decency. The First Opium War was nearly over, but its consequences were just beginning. Chapter 4: Silver Drain. The numbers coming out of China shocked even seasoned British merchants. By 1838, opium imports had completely reversed the historic flow of silver between Britain and China. For the first time in recorded history, more Chinese silver was flowing west then flowing east. The transformation was staggering in its speed and scale. In 1800, China had imported roughly 4,000 chests of opium annually. By 1838, that number had exploded to 40,000 chests, a tenfold increase in less than 4 decades. Each chest contained 140 pounds of refined narcotic, meaning China was importing 5.6 million pounds of opium every year. But the real impact wasn't measured in drug quantities, it was measured in silver outflows. Chinese customers paid for opium exclusively in silver, and the prices were astronomical. A single chest of opium sold for 600–800 silver taels, depending on quality and market conditions. With 40,000 chests imported annually, Chinese consumers were spending 24 to 32 million silver taels each year on British narcotics. To put this in perspective, China's total annual tax revenue was approximately 40 million silver taels. Chinese citizens were spending nearly 80% of their government's entire budget on a single imported product that provided no economic benefit whatsoever. The money wasn't buying infrastructure, technology, or productive goods, it was buying addiction. The East India Company's financial records tell the story with brutal clarity. Opium sales generated $3.7 million annually for the company by 1838, roughly equivalent to $400 million today. This single product line generated more profit than all other company operations in Asia combined. Opium had become Britain's most valuable export, more profitable than textiles, manufactured goods, or traditional trading commodities. Even more remarkably, opium profits were essentially pure profit. The East India Company controlled every aspect of production. They owned the land where poppies grew, employed the farmers who cultivated them, operated the facilities that processed them, and commanded the ships that transported them. Production costs were minimal, labor was cheap, land was abundant, and processing technology was simple. The profit margins were unprecedented in commercial history. Raw opium cost approximately 40 rupees per chest to produce in Bengal. That same chest sold for 600–800 silver taels in Canton, a markup of roughly 2,000%. No legitimate business had ever achieved such extraordinary profit margins on such massive scale. British merchants understood they had created something revolutionary, a product that generated its own demand, required no marketing or competitive pricing, and commanded whatever price they chose to charge. Addicted customers would pay any amount, borrow any sum, or steal any quantity of money to purchase their next supply. The silver drain created cascading economic effects throughout China. Provincial governments found themselves unable to collect taxes because citizens were spending their money on opium instead of paying tax obligations. Merchants couldn't afford to stock legitimate goods because their customers preferred spending money on drugs. Agricultural regions began experiencing labor shortages as workers became too addicted to farm effectively. Chinese economic advisors recognized they were facing something unprecedented. Traditional economic theory assumed that imports provided value, tools, materials, or goods that enhanced domestic productivity. But opium imports provided negative value. They drained money from the economy while reducing productivity, creating addiction problems that required additional social spending. Emperor Daoguang received increasingly desperate reports from provincial governors describing local economic collapse. In Fujian province, tax collection had fallen by 40% as citizens diverted money to opium purchases. In Guangdong, traditional manufacturing was declining. Because workers were unreliable and customers were impoverished, the emperor convened special economic councils to study the silver drain problem. Court economists calculated that at current rates of opium importation, China would exhaust its silver reserves within 2 decades. The empire that had accumulated global silver for centuries through superior manufacturing and trade was hemorrhaging wealth to buy British-grown narcotics. Chinese officials tried various economic solutions before resorting to prohibition. They attempted to tax opium imports, hoping to reduce consumption while generating government revenue. But taxation proved impossible. Opium was already illegal, so there was no legal framework for taxing illegal goods. They considered creating government-controlled opium distribution, similar to salt or liquor monopolies. This would eliminate foreign merchants while generating domestic revenue. But Emperor Daoguang rejected this approach on moral grounds. The government shouldn't profit from citizen addiction, even if foreign merchants were already doing so. They explored import substitution, encouraging domestic poppy cultivation to replace foreign opium. Chinese agricultural experts confirmed that domestic poppies could produce opium comparable to Bengal varieties. But this solution would worsen the addiction problem while keeping silver within China but diverting it from productive uses. Finally, they attempted diplomatic solutions. Chinese officials approached British representatives requesting voluntary reduction of opium imports. They offered to purchase equivalent quantities of legitimate British products if merchants would abandon drug trafficking. British merchants politely declined. Nothing Britain produced was as profitable as addiction. The silver drain also created geopolitical vulnerabilities that Chinese strategists were beginning to recognize. China's military strength had historically depended on their ability to purchase advanced weapons, hire foreign military advisors, and fund defensive preparations using silver reserves. But opium imports were depleting exactly the financial resources China needed for national defense. Worse, the British were using opium profits to fund their own military modernization. The Royal Navy's expansion, the East India Company's private armies, and Britain's global imperial operations were all partially funded through Chinese silver spent on British narcotics. China was literally funding the military forces that would soon be used against them. British strategists understood this dynamic perfectly. Lord Palmerston wrote privately, "The Chinese are purchasing the rope with which we shall hang them." Chinese silver spent on British opium became British military spending that enhanced British power relative to China. The economic warfare was working exactly as Britain intended. They had created a system where Chinese wealth automatically transferred to British control, Chinese productivity declined through addiction, and Chinese military capabilities were undermined by resource depletion. Opium wasn't just profitable, it was strategically brilliant. Commissioner Lin Zexu calculated the ultimate implications in his final report to Emperor Daoguang. If we do not stop the opium trade immediately, China will have no soldiers for defense, no money for government, and no people capable of production. This is not trade, this is economic conquest through systematic poisoning. Lin was absolutely correct, but his analysis came too late. The silver had already flowed, the addiction was already established, and the British military forces funded by Chinese opium purchases were already approaching Chinese territorial waters. The First Opium War would prove that economic warfare could be more devastating than military conquest. Britain had discovered how to capture an empire without occupying its territory, by making its people destroy themselves. The cabinet meeting of October 1, 1839 would determine whether the British Crown officially endorsed drug trafficking as imperial policy. Foreign Secretary Lord Palmerston faced a room full of Britain's most powerful officials, each representing different interests in what everyone understood was about more than opium. Prime Minister Lord Melbourne opened the discussion by reading Commissioner Lin's letter to Queen Victoria. The Chinese officials appeal for moral consideration of the opium trade's effects on Chinese people. The letter was eloquent, reasoned, and devastating in its moral clarity. It exposed the fundamental contradiction in British policy, demanding the right to sell Chinese people drugs that Britain banned for its own citizens. Chancellor of the Exchequer, Thomas Spring Rice, presented the economic arguments. The East India Company's opium operations generated $3.7 million annually, roughly 15% of the company's total revenue from India. This money funded British operations across Asia, supported thousands of jobs in Britain, and contributed significantly to the treasury through company taxation and dividend payments. More importantly, Rice explained, the opium trade had solved Britain's most persistent economic problem. Chinese markets had historically drained British silver reserves because China produced everything better and cheaper than European competitors. Opium reversed this dynamic. Chinese silver now flowed to Britain, funding industrial expansion and imperial operations globally. War Secretary Lord Hill outlined the military implications. Chinese resistance to British commerce couldn't be tolerated because it established precedents for other Asian powers. If China successfully banned British imports, similar restrictions might spread across Asia, potentially eliminating Britain's most profitable overseas markets. Hill also emphasized technological advantages. British naval supremacy in Asian waters was unquestioned. Chinese military forces used outdated equipment and obsolete tactics. A brief military campaign would demonstrate British power while securing permanent commercial advantages. The costs would be minimal compared to potential profits. But several cabinet members expressed serious moral reservations. Lord Ashley, speaking for evangelical Christians in Parliament, argued that Britain couldn't justify selling narcotics to foreign populations while maintaining Christian missionary activities. How could British missionaries preach moral salvation while British merchants provided spiritual damnation? Home Secretary Lord Normanby raised practical concerns about public opinion. Parliamentary debates about Chinese policy were attracting significant attention, with opposition members like William Gladstone delivering devastating speeches about Britain's transformation into a drug trafficking organization. The government needed convincing justifications for what appeared to be an immoral war. Palmerston understood that the cabinet's decision would establish precedents far beyond Chinese policy. Britain was rapidly becoming a global imperial power, encountering resistance to British commerce in multiple regions simultaneously. The Chinese situation would demonstrate whether Britain would accept local sovereignty over trade or impose British commercial preferences through force. Palmerston's argument was brilliantly crafted to address both moral concerns and strategic imperatives. He framed Chinese resistance not as drug enforcement, but as commercial aggression against legitimate British interests. Chinese authorities hadn't just seized illegal narcotics, they had violated property rights and imprisoned British subjects without proper legal procedures. This framing allowed cabinet members to support military action while maintaining moral justifications. They weren't endorsing drug trafficking, they were defending British citizens against Chinese violations of international law. Never mind that the citizens were drug traffickers and the violations were enforcement of Chinese domestic law. Palmerston also emphasized the free trade principle. British merchants should be permitted to sell any legal product in international markets without interference from local governments. Chinese attempts to ban specific imports violated natural economic laws that transcended national sovereignty. The free trade argument had obvious flaws. Opium wasn't legal under Chinese law, and Britain itself banned opium domestically. But Palmerston solved this by arguing that Chinese law was inherently invalid because it conflicted with British commercial interests. Local sovereignty couldn't supersede British economic rights. Chancellor Rice provided crucial support by calculating the financial implications of backing down. If Britain accepted Chinese authority over trade, similar restrictions might spread throughout Asia. The potential loss of Asian markets could cost Britain millions of pounds annually, while strengthening competitors like France, Russia, or the United States. More importantly, Rice argued, Chinese success in resisting British commerce might encourage similar resistance in India, where the East India Company's authority depended on perceived British invincibility. Accepting Chinese defiance might trigger independence movements across Britain's Asian territories. The strategic argument proved decisive. Cabinet members might have moral qualms about drug trafficking, but they couldn't ignore threats to British imperial authority. China wasn't just challenging opium sales, they were challenging Britain's right to impose commercial terms on Asian markets. Foreign Minister Palmerston summarized the government's position. British subjects have been illegally detained, British property has been arbitrarily seized, and British commerce has been unlawfully restricted. Her Majesty's government cannot permit such outrages without seeking appropriate satisfaction. The language was carefully chosen to obscure moral issues while emphasizing legal grievances. British subjects were drug traffickers, British property was contraband narcotics, and British commerce was illegal under Chinese law. But Palmerston's formulation made Chinese law enforcement sound like aggression against Britain. Prime Minister Melbourne called for a formal vote. The cabinet voted 8-3 to support military action against China, with religious-minded members comprising the opposition minority. The Crown had officially endorsed drug trafficking as legitimate imperial policy. Queen Victoria herself never expressed public opinion about the opium trade, maintaining constitutional silence about government policy. But her private correspondence reveals awareness of moral issues. She wrote to her advisor, Baron Stockmar, "The China question troubles me greatly. I cannot reconcile my conscience to some aspects of our commercial interests." But Victoria's personal concerns didn't translate into policy opposition. The Crown's financial interests aligned with government decisions. Royal revenues partially depended on imperial profits, including those generated through opium sales. Economic considerations outweighed moral reservations. The cabinet decision triggered immediate implementation. The Admiralty received orders to assemble naval forces for Chinese operations. The War Department began recruiting marine contingents for amphibious operations. The East India Company received authorization to coordinate military action with commercial objectives. Most importantly, the cabinet authorized what became known as the Elliott Instructions, detailed guidelines for British negotiating positions with Chinese authorities. These instructions revealed the true scope of British objectives, which extended far beyond resuming opium sales. Britain demanded permanent territorial concessions, extraterritorial rights for British citizens, indemnity payments for destroyed opium, and complete access to Chinese markets. The instructions envisioned transforming China from a sovereign empire into a British commercial dependency. Parliamentary opposition immediately challenged the cabinet decision. Gladstone delivered his famous speech denouncing this infamous and atrocious war waged to force British narcotics on Chinese people. But Parliament ultimately supported the government by a narrow majority, prioritizing imperial interests over moral considerations. The Crown's decision established precedents that would define British imperial policy for the next century. Local sovereignty was subordinate to British commercial interests. Military force was an acceptable tool for securing trade advantages. Drug trafficking was legitimate if it served broader strategic objectives. The Opium Wars weren't an aberration in British imperial policy. They were the logical culmination of principles that prioritized British wealth and power over all other considerations, including basic human decency. The Royal Navy was already sailing toward Chinese waters, carrying orders that would reshape the global balance of power and establish Britain as history's most successful narco-empire. Chapter 6. Armed Merchants. HMS Voyage approached the Pearl River estuary at dawn on November 3, 1839, flying battle flags and clearing for action. Captain Henry Smith commanded not just a warship, but the advance guard of history's first drug war, a military campaign explicitly designed to force narcotics sales on an unwilling population. The British fleet assembled off Hong Kong represented unprecedented naval power, concentrated for commercial rather than territorial objectives. 16 warships, including the revolutionary iron-hulled steamer Nemesis, plus 4,000 Marines and the most advanced military technology available in 1839. But their mission wasn't conquest in any traditional sense. It was market access enforcement through systematic violence. Captain Charles Elliott, commanding the expedition, carried detailed instructions from London outlining British objectives: resume opium sales, secure indemnity for destroyed drugs, establish permanent British trading rights, and demonstrate the consequences of resisting British commerce. The war aims were explicitly commercial, with military force serving economic rather than territorial goals. The technology gap between British and Chinese forces was so vast that military historians now classify the First Opium War as the earliest example of modern asymmetric warfare. British ships featured iron armor, steam propulsion, explosive shells, and modern artillery that could accurately target fortifications from distances beyond Chinese response capabilities. Chinese naval forces relied on traditional wooden junks, smoothbore cannons, and defensive tactics designed for historical threats. Their ships were literally floating targets for British technology. Chinese return fire bounced harmlessly off British iron hulls, while British explosive shells devastated Chinese vessels with single hits. The Nemesis alone demonstrated technological superiority that Chinese observers described as supernatural. Powered by steam engines that made it independent of wind conditions, armored with iron plates that deflected traditional artillery, and armed with modern cannons that could destroy Chinese fortifications from safe distances, the ship seemed immune to conventional warfare. British military doctrine recognized they possessed overwhelming advantages, but emphasized speed and psychological impact rather than prolonged campaigns. The goal was demonstrating irresistible British power while minimizing costs and international criticism. Quick victories would prove that resistance was futile while limiting negative publicity about Britain's drug trafficking war. The first engagement at Chwempi revealed Chinese military obsolescence with shocking clarity. Chinese coastal fortifications, designed to repel traditional naval attacks, crumbled under modern British bombardment within hours. Chinese artillery crews watched their cannonballs bounce off British ships, while British explosive shells demolished their positions. Chinese Admiral Guan Tianpei, commanding defensive operations, wrote desperately to Beijing describing weapons that seemed to violate natural laws. The foreign ships move without wind, their hulls resist our strongest cannons, and their shells explode inside our fortifications like thunder from clear skies. We face enemies who possess powers beyond our understanding. Guan wasn't witnessing supernatural powers. He was experiencing the first industrial military technologies used against pre-industrial forces. But the effect was psychologically devastating for Chinese defenders who had never encountered steam propulsion, iron armor, or explosive shells. British commanders exploited Chinese technological ignorance ruthlessly. They positioned their ships to maximize the visual impact of steam propulsion, used explosive shells primarily for their psychological rather than tactical effects, and timed operations to suggest supernatural control over natural forces. The Nemesis proved particularly effective at psychological warfare. Captain W.H. Hall described using the ship's steam power to appear motionless in strong currents, creating the impression of supernatural stability. Chinese observers believed they were fighting vessels controlled by foreign spirits or demons. But British strategy extended beyond technological intimidation. Elliot understood that permanent commercial advantages required destroying Chinese confidence in their government's ability to provide protection. Military victories needed to demonstrate not just British strength but Chinese governmental incompetence. British forces specifically targeted symbols of imperial authority: coastal fortifications, government buildings, military installations, and imperial monuments. The goal was undermining Chinese confidence in their traditional political system while positioning British merchants as reliable partners for Chinese economic development. The strategy worked perfectly. Chinese merchants who had initially supported Commissioner Lin's anti-opium campaign began questioning government capabilities. If Chinese authorities couldn't protect Chinese territory from foreign attack, how could they protect Chinese commerce from foreign competition? Chinese officials found themselves trapped between impossible alternatives. Continued resistance meant military devastation and economic collapse, but surrender meant accepting foreign control over Chinese domestic policy, including the legalization of drug trafficking that violated Chinese law and Confucian morality. Emperor Daoguang received increasingly desperate reports from the war zone describing technological gaps that made meaningful resistance impossible. Chinese forces weren't being defeated through cowardice or incompetence. They were being eliminated through technological obsolescence. The emperor convened emergency sessions with his top military advisors, seeking strategies for asymmetric resistance against superior British technology. Some recommended guerrilla tactics, others suggested diplomatic solutions, and a few proposed accepting British demands while secretly planning future retaliation. But all Chinese strategies faced the same fundamental problem. Britain controlled the seas, possessed superior technology, and could attack anywhere along China's massive coastline, while Chinese forces had to defend everywhere simultaneously. Traditional Chinese military advantages, superior numbers, defensive terrain, and supply lines were irrelevant against modern naval power. British merchants embedded with military forces began calculating commercial opportunities created by Chinese military collapse. Disrupted traditional trade networks, created openings for British products. Weakened Chinese authorities couldn't enforce regulations limiting foreign business activities. Military victory was creating exactly the market access that opium profits had originally sought. The East India Company's commercial agents, accompanied British military forces, identifying potential markets, evaluating local economic conditions, and negotiating preliminary trade agreements with Chinese merchants desperate for foreign protection. Military conquest was immediately translating into commercial penetration. Most importantly, British forces demonstrated that opium prohibition was unenforceable against foreign military power. Chinese authorities could ban drug sales, arrest Chinese collaborators, and even destroy foreign drug stockpiles. But they couldn't prevent armed foreign merchants from imposing their commercial preferences through superior military technology. Captain Elliot reported to London, "The Chinese have learned that their ancient empire cannot resist modern commerce backed by modern military force. They must choose between accepting British trade terms or watching their coastal cities burn." The choice wasn't really about opium anymore. It was about whether China would maintain sovereignty over its domestic economic policy or accept British control over Chinese markets. The drug trade had become a test case for imperial dominance, disguised as commercial freedom. Chinese resistance was collapsing not through military defeat, but through technological impossibility. They couldn't fight weapons they didn't understand, using tactics that assumed technological parity. The First Opium War was demonstrating that military technology determined commercial rights in the modern world. British victory was inevitable from the moment steam-powered iron-armored warships entered Chinese territorial waters. The only question was whether Chinese authorities would surrender quickly or watch their empire burn while learning the same lesson more slowly. The age of European technological superiority over Asian civilizations had begun, and its first application was forcing narcotics sales on unwilling populations. The template was established. Superior military technology justified any commercial objective, regardless of local law, sovereignty, or basic human decency. The cabinet meeting of October 1, 1839, would determine whether the British Crown officially endorsed drug trafficking as imperial policy. Foreign Secretary Lord Palmerston faced a room full of Britain's most powerful officials, each representing different interests in what everyone understood was about more than opium. Chapter 7. Treaty Terms. The Treaty of Nanking, signed aboard HMS Cornwallis on August 29, 1842, didn't just end the First Opium War. It created the blueprint for economic colonialism that European powers would use to dominate Asia for the next century. Chinese negotiator Chiang faced British plenipotentiary Henry Pottinger across a table stacked with demands that would have been unthinkable before British warships demonstrated Chinese military obsolescence. The treaty wasn't a negotiation between equals. It was a dictation of terms to a defeated power that had learned the price of resisting British commerce. The first demand was financial. China would pay 21 million silver tiles as indemnity, roughly 3.2 billion in today's money. 6 million for destroyed opium, 6 million for British military expenses, 9 million for Chinese debts to British merchants. China was required to compensate Britain for the costs of the war. Britain had started to force drug sales on Chinese people. The financial terms alone would devastate Chinese treasury reserves for decades. The entire Chinese annual tax revenue was approximately 40 million silver taels, meaning the indemnity represented more than half a year's total government income. China would be forced to borrow money internationally or raise taxes domestically to pay Britain for the privilege of being militarily defeated. But the financial demands were secondary to territorial concessions that fundamentally altered Chinese sovereignty. Britain demanded permanent possession of Hong Kong Island, a strategic harbour that would become the nerve centre of British commercial operations in Asia. Hong Kong wasn't just territory. It was a fortified base from which British forces could threaten Chinese coastal cities while protecting British commercial interests. Possession of Hong Kong meant Britain could resume opium trafficking under the protection of the Royal Navy, making future Chinese resistance militarily impossible. More devastating were the treaty ports, 5 Chinese cities where British citizens would enjoy extraterritorial rights, meaning they were subject to British rather than Chinese law, even while operating on Chinese territory. Canton, Xiamen, Fuzhou, Ningbo and Shanghai became essentially British commercial colonies within Chinese borders. The extraterritorial provisions created a legal framework for unlimited British commercial penetration of Chinese markets. British merchants operating from treaty ports could ignore Chinese regulations, avoid Chinese taxes, and appeal to British consular protection if Chinese authorities attempted law enforcement. Most importantly for the opium trade, extraterritorial rights meant Chinese officials couldn't prosecute British drug trafficking unless British consuls approved such prosecutions. Since British consuls were instructed to protect British commercial interests, opium sales would resume under official British protection. The treaty also established the principle of most favored nation status. Any commercial privileges China granted to other foreign powers would automatically extend to Britain. This prevented China from playing European powers against each other or limiting British access through discriminatory trade policies. Chinese negotiator Qiying understood he was signing away Chinese sovereignty over domestic economic policy, but alternatives were worse. British forces had demonstrated their ability to destroy Chinese coastal defenses, blockade Chinese ports, and disrupt Chinese commerce indefinitely. Continued resistance meant economic collapse and possible governmental overthrow. British negotiator Pottinger faced different pressures. London expected treaties that would permanently secure British commercial advantages while establishing precedents for future dealings with Asian powers. The Chinese agreement needed to demonstrate that resistance to British trade resulted in devastating consequences. Pottinger also represented competing British interests that weren't always compatible. The East India Company wanted maximum protection for opium operations and minimal regulation of drug trafficking. British manufacturers wanted access to Chinese markets for legitimate products. The Royal Navy wanted strategic bases for projecting British power throughout Asia. The treaty solved these competing demands by establishing British commercial supremacy across all sectors. Opium trafficking would resume under extraterritorial protection. British manufactured goods would enter Chinese markets with minimal tariffs. British military forces would operate from permanent bases on Chinese territory. But the treaty's most significant innovation was its implicit acknowledgement that military technology determined commercial rights. China was forced to accept British trade terms, not because those terms were economically beneficial or morally justified, but because Britain possessed superior weapons and demonstrated willingness to use them. This principle, that technological superiority justified commercial dominance, would reshape global economic relationships for the next century. European powers could impose their preferred trade terms on Asian societies through military threats, regardless of local sovereignty, economic interests, or popular opposition. The opium provisions were deliberately obscured through diplomatic language that avoided explicit drug legalization while ensuring British trafficking operations could resume. The treaty established free trade principles that prevented Chinese authorities from discriminating against specific British imports, effectively legalizing opium sales without explicitly mentioning narcotics. Chinese officials understood the implications perfectly. Imperial Commissioner Qiying wrote privately to Emperor Daoguang, "We have agreed to permit the foreign poison to flow freely into our empire while paying the foreigners for the privilege of our own destruction. This treaty ensures that resistance is impossible, while surrender is profitable only for our enemies." Emperor Daoguang faced the most humiliating decision in Chinese imperial history: accept terms that violated fundamental principles of Chinese sovereignty or continue a war that was destroying Chinese civilization. He chose acceptance, writing bitterly, "We submit to these demands not because they are just, but because resistance has proven impossible." The treaty ratification process revealed how completely the balance of power had shifted. Chinese authorities were required to implement British demands immediately, while British compliance with Chinese concerns was voluntary and conditional. Britain had gained the power to interpret treaty terms unilaterally, while China became dependent on British goodwill for basic trade access. British merchants immediately began planning expanded operations based on treaty provisions. The East India Company calculated that extraterritorial rights would reduce operational risks, while treaty ports provided secure bases for distribution networks. Opium sales could expand dramatically under British legal protection. More importantly, the treaty established precedents that other European powers quickly adopted. French, American, and Russian negotiators demanded similar extraterritorial rights and commercial privileges, creating a competitive dynamic that further undermined Chinese sovereignty. Within 5 years of the Treaty of Nanking, China had signed similar agreements with multiple foreign powers, each extracting additional commercial concessions while contributing nothing to Chinese economic development. China was becoming a semi-colonial economy, controlled by foreign merchants operating under foreign legal protection. The treaty's long-term impact extended far beyond China. European powers recognized they had discovered a formula for controlling Asian economies without the costs of direct territorial administration. Military pressure could secure commercial advantages that generated profits while maintaining plausible deniability about imperial ambitions. The Treaty of Nanking wasn't just the end of the First Opium War. It was the beginning of economic colonialism as the dominant form of European expansion in Asia. Military technology had proven more effective than territorial conquest for controlling foreign markets and extracting economic tribute. China's ancient empire had learned that sovereignty was conditional on military power, that economic independence required technological equality, and that moral authority was irrelevant when facing superior weapons operated by people willing to use them for commercial advantage. The opium trade would resume immediately, protected by British law and enforced by British weapons, generating profits that would fund further British expansion while ensuring Chinese dependency on foreign narcotics for decades to come. Chapter 8. Global Blueprint. The success in China created what British imperial planners privately called the Chinese model, a template for controlling foreign markets without the expense of direct colonial administration. Within a decade, Britain was applying opium war tactics across Asia, establishing the foundation for what would become the largest drug trafficking empire in human history. The model was elegantly simple: identify profitable but illegal trade opportunities, use military pressure to secure commercial rights that made local law enforcement impossible, frame resistance as violations of free trade principles, apply superior military technology to ensure compliance, extract maximum profits while maintaining plausible deniability about criminal activities. India became the production hub for Britain's expanding narcotics empire. The East India Company transformed entire agricultural regions into opium cultivation zones, replacing food crops with poppies and creating economic dependency on drug exports. By 1850, British-controlled territories were producing 50,000 chests of opium annually, equivalent to 7 million pounds of refined narcotic. The scale of Indian opium production required systematic reorganization of local agriculture. British officials offered advance payments to farmers who agreed to dedicate their land to poppy cultivation. They provided seeds, technical assistance, and guaranteed purchase agreements. Within 2 decades, millions of Indian farmers had become economically dependent on British drug operations. British agricultural experts improved cultivation techniques, developing new poppy varieties that produced higher morphine content while requiring less processing. They established quality control systems, ensuring consistent potency across different production regions. They created the world's most efficient narcotic manufacturing operation, optimized for export to Asian markets. The processing facilities built across Bengal and Bihar represented industrial-scale drug manufacturing, unprecedented in world history. British supervised workers transformed raw poppy sap into smokable opium, using techniques that maximized addiction potential while minimizing production costs. The operations resembled modern pharmaceutical manufacturing more than traditional agricultural processing. But China remained the primary market for British narcotics. Despite the Treaty of Nanking, Chinese officials continued attempting to limit opium imports through local regulations, tax policies, and enforcement campaigns. British merchants complained about these restrictions, demanding additional military intervention to secure complete market access. The Second Opium War, 1856-1860, demonstrated how effectively Britain had perfected their economic warfare model. Using the pretext of Chinese interference with British shipping, Royal Navy forces captured Beijing itself, forcing Emperor Xianfeng to accept even more devastating terms than his predecessor. The Treaty of Tientsin 1858 completed China's transformation into a British commercial dependency. 20 additional treaty ports opened to British trade, the Yangtze River became accessible to British shipping, and opium imports were explicitly legalized under Chinese law. China was forced to abandon legal prohibition of the drug that was destroying its population. More importantly, the treaty established British control over Chinese customs administration. Robert Hart, a British official, became Inspector General of Chinese Maritime Customs, ensuring that trade policies served British rather than Chinese interests. China lost the ability to regulate its own international commerce. The success in China encouraged British expansion of narcotics operations throughout Southeast Asia. Burma, Malaya, and other British territories became secondary production zones, while Singapore emerged as a major distribution hub for British opium throughout the region. British officials applied Chinese war lessons to resistance elsewhere in Asia. When local rulers restricted British commerce, they faced the same threats: accept British trade terms or experience military consequences. The Royal Navy's Asian fleet ensured that resistance was futile while compliance was immediately rewarded. The opium model also influenced British imperial strategy outside Asia. In Africa and the Middle East, Britain used similar tactics: identify profitable trade opportunities, eliminate local resistance through military pressure, establish commercial privileges that served British interests while undermining local sovereignty. But the drug empire's most significant innovation was financial. Opium profits funded British imperial expansion globally, creating a self-reinforcing cycle where drug money purchased military capabilities that secured additional drug markets. Chinese silver spent on British narcotics became British military spending that conquered new territories and markets. The East India Company's accounting records reveal the extraordinary profitability of their narcotics operations. By 1857, opium sales generated 6.7 million annually, equivalent to 700 million today. This single product line generated more revenue than all other British exports to Asia combined. The profits transformed Britain's global position. Naval expansion, military modernization, and colonial administration were all partially funded through Asian drug sales. Britain's emergence as the dominant global power in the mid-19th century was directly connected to their success in systematic narcotics trafficking. British banks, shipping companies, and insurance firms all benefited from the drug trade's profitability. Jardine Matheson, Dent and Company, and other British commercial houses built massive fortunes through opium distribution while maintaining respectability in London society. The social impact in China continued worsening throughout the 1850s. British estimates suggested 10 out of 15 million Chinese people had become addicted to imported opium, roughly 4% of the total population. Entire regions experienced economic collapse as productive citizens became unemployable due to drug dependency. Chinese officials documented the social devastation in reports to Beijing. Families destroyed by addiction, agricultural regions unable to harvest crops, military units unreliable due to officer addiction, and government revenues depleted by citizens spending money on drugs instead of paying taxes. But British officials dismissed Chinese concerns about addiction as exaggerated complaints designed to justify protectionist trade policies. They argued that opium use was a personal choice, and that restricting opium sales violated individual freedom and commercial rights. The argument was cynically dishonest. British medical experts understood addiction science perfectly well, and British law prohibited opium use by British citizens. But it provided legal justification for policies that everyone involved knew were systematically destroying Chinese society. More importantly, British officials recognized that Chinese addiction served strategic objectives beyond immediate profits. Widespread drug dependency weakened Chinese military capabilities, reduced Chinese economic productivity, and created political instability that made organized resistance to British influence increasingly difficult. Lord Clarendon, British Foreign Secretary, wrote privately in 1857, "The opium trade serves our interests in multiple ways. It generates immediate profits, weakens Chinese resistance to our commercial penetration, and ensures their continued dependency on our goodwill." We have discovered how to make conquest profitable for us and poisonous for them. The Chinese model had proven that economic warfare could be more effective than military conquest for controlling foreign populations. Drug trafficking was just the most profitable application of broader principles that prioritized British commercial interests over local sovereignty, human welfare, or basic morality. By 1860, Britain had established what was essentially a narco-empire spanning from India to China, generating profits that funded global imperial expansion while creating addiction crises that destabilized Asian societies and made resistance to British dominance increasingly impossible. The template was complete, tested, and ready for application wherever British commercial interests encountered local resistance. The world's first systematic economic warfare campaign had proven its effectiveness and its profitability. Chapter 9. Modern Echoes. The British Opium Empire officially ended in 1917 when the last legal opium sales concluded, but its impact echoes through modern geopolitics in ways most people never recognize. The techniques Britain pioneered for controlling foreign markets through systematic drug trafficking became the blueprint for economic warfare that major powers still use today. When American officials discuss economic sanctions, trade enforcement, or market access rights, they're using concepts that originated during Britain's Opium Wars. The idea that superior military power justifies imposing commercial terms on weaker nations, regardless of their domestic law or sovereignty, traces directly back to 1839, British justifications for attacking China. Modern China's leadership understands this connection intimately. When Xi Jinping references the century of humiliation that began with the Opium Wars, he's not making historical observations. He's identifying patterns that Chinese strategists believe continue today. From Beijing's perspective, contemporary trade disputes often resemble updated versions of 19th century economic warfare. The Hong Kong handover in 1997 marked symbolic closure of the Opium Empire's territorial legacy, but the commercial principles established through drug trafficking remain embedded in international trade law. Most favored nation status, extraterritorial corporate rights, and trade dispute mechanisms all originated in treaties forced on China at gunpoint by British opium merchants. HSBC Bank provides the most direct institutional continuity between historical opium trafficking and modern financial systems. Founded in 1865 as the Hong Kong and Shanghai Banking Corporation, HSBC was explicitly created to manage British drug money from Asian operations. The bank's original purpose was laundering opium profits while providing legitimate financial services to British merchants operating in Chinese markets. Today, HSBC remains one of the world's largest banks, while facing persistent allegations about money laundering for drug traffickers, terrorist organizations, and authoritarian regimes. In 2012, HSBC paid $1.9 billion in fines for laundering money for Mexican drug cartels and violating sanctions against Iran, Libya, Sudan, and Burma. The bank admitted to processing $881 million in drug proceeds while ignoring obvious signs of criminal activity. The parallels are striking. HSBC's 19th century role involved processing opium profits while maintaining plausible deniability about drug trafficking origins. Their 21st century violations involved identical techniques, processing criminal proceeds while avoiding questions about money sources. The bank's institutional culture appears unchanged, despite 150 years of supposed regulatory evolution. Standard Chartered, another major British bank with Asian operations, faced similar money laundering allegations involving Iranian sanctions violations and terrorist financing. Like HSBC, Standard Chartered's origins traced directly to British imperial operations in Asia during the Opium period. These banks didn't accidentally develop money laundering capabilities. They were designed for exactly those purposes. The City of London financial district, which emerged as Europe's dominant financial centre during the Opium period, continues serving as a global hub for questionable financial flows. British financial regulations specifically accommodate private banking services that prioritize client anonymity over source transparency. Wealthy individuals from authoritarian regimes, criminal organizations, and corrupt governments can easily access British financial services without meaningful scrutiny. This system isn't accidental. It's the direct descendant of financial mechanisms developed to handle British opium profits during the 19th century. The same legal structures, regulatory approaches, and institutional practices that legitimized drug money 200 years ago continue facilitating similar activities today. Modern pharmaceutical companies operate using business models pioneered by the East India Company's narcotics operations. They control cultivation, research and development, processing, manufacturing, and distribution, marketing, while using legal frameworks to eliminate competition and maintain pricing power. The opioid epidemic in America demonstrates how these techniques work when applied to domestic rather than foreign populations. OxyContin's manufacturer Purdue Pharma used tactics strikingly similar to British opium merchants. Minimize addiction risks, maximize prescriptions, lobby against regulation, and blame users rather than suppliers when addiction problems emerged. The company generated billions in profits while creating millions of addicts, just like the East India Company did in China. The Sackler family, which controlled Purdue Pharma, accumulated a personal fortune estimated at $13 billion through OxyContin sales, while knowing their product was creating widespread addiction. Internal company documents revealed that Sackler family members were personally involved in marketing strategies designed to increase prescriptions among vulnerable populations, including elderly patients and people with chronic pain conditions. Purdue Pharma's marketing techniques directly paralleled British opium promotion in 19th century China. Company sales representatives were instructed to downplay addiction risks while emphasizing pain relief benefits. They targeted doctors in economically depressed areas where patients were less likely to question medical advice or seek second opinions. They provided financial incentives to physicians who prescribed large quantities of opioids while avoiding markets where addiction problems might attract regulatory attention. The geographic distribution of America's opioid epidemic mirrors the pattern of British opium addiction in China. Addiction rates are highest in Appalachian communities, Rust Belt cities, and rural areas, with limited economic opportunities and weakened social institutions. Just like 19th century China, modern American addiction concentrates in populations that lack political power to resist systematic exploitation. Johnson & Johnson, another major pharmaceutical company involved in opioid manufacturing, used similar techniques while maintaining even greater respectability. The company promoted opioid prescriptions through front organizations that appeared to be independent medical associations, but were actually funded by pharmaceutical companies. They published research minimizing addiction risks while suppressing studies that demonstrated opposite conclusions. These tactics directly parallel British techniques during the opium period. The East India Company funded medical experts who argued that opium was beneficial for Chinese health while suppressing information about addiction dangers. They created front organizations that appeared independent, but actually served company commercial interests. They promoted opium use among vulnerable populations while avoiding markets where problems might attract unwanted attention. The CIA's involvement in drug trafficking during the Cold War provides the most direct parallel to British opium operations. Agency operatives supported narcotics producers in Afghanistan, Southeast Asia, and Latin America to fund anti-communist operations while maintaining plausible deniability about drug trafficking activities. During the Vietnam War, CIA operatives worked directly with Hmong tribes in Laos, who cultivated opium poppies for heroin production. The agency provided military protection for drug cultivation areas, transported processed narcotics using agency aircraft, and helped establish distribution networks that supplied American military personnel and Asian markets. The operations generated funds for covert operations while creating addiction problems among American soldiers. The Iran-Contra scandal revealed similar CIA involvement in cocaine trafficking during the 1980s. Agency operatives facilitated drug shipments from Nicaragua to Los Angeles while using profits to fund Contra rebels in Central America. The operations followed the British opium model perfectly, used drug profits to fund military operations while maintaining governmental deniability about criminal activities. More recently, American military operations in Afghanistan have occurred alongside massive expansion of opium cultivation. Afghanistan produces roughly 80% of the world's illegal opium today, with cultivation areas concentrated in regions under American military protection. While American officials deny direct involvement in drug trafficking, the coincidence of military presence and opium expansion follows historical patterns established during British operations. The institutional parallels are remarkable. British military forces in 19th century Afghanistan provided security for opium cultivation areas that supplied Chinese markets. American military forces in 21st century Afghanistan operate in regions that supply global heroin markets. Both operations involve protecting drug cultivation while pursuing broader geopolitical objectives. DEA operations in Latin America demonstrate how drug enforcement can serve geopolitical rather than public health objectives. American drug enforcement efforts consistently target organizations that oppose American political interests while ignoring groups that support American foreign policy goals. The pattern suggests that drug enforcement serves imperial rather than criminal justice purposes. Contemporary economic sanctions represent the most direct descendant of British Opium War tactics. When powerful nations use economic pressure to force policy changes in weaker countries, they're applying techniques perfected during Britain's systematic destruction of Chinese economic sovereignty. American sanctions against Iran demonstrate the updated model clearly. The United States doesn't need military invasion to control Iranian domestic policy. Financial pressure achieves the same objectives more efficiently. By restricting Iranian access to international banking systems, American officials can devastate the Iranian economy while maintaining that they're simply enforcing international law. The legal justifications are identical to those British officials used during the opium period. American sanctions are presented as enforcement of international norms rather than coercion of sovereign governments. Iranian resistance to American economic demands is framed as violations of international obligations rather than legitimate exercises of national sovereignty. SWIFT, the International Banking Communication System, has become the modern equivalent of Royal Navy control over Asian shipping routes. American officials can exclude any country from global financial systems simply by pressuring SWIFT to terminate their access. This gives the United States the ability to economically devastate any nation that depends on international trade, regardless of their military capabilities. Russian sanctions following the Ukraine invasion demonstrate how economic warfare can be more effective than military campaigns. Western financial restrictions have damaged the Russian economy more severely than direct military attacks on Russian territory. The sanctions target Russian access to technology, financial systems, and international markets, while avoiding the costs and risks of military confrontation. The sanctions also demonstrate how economic warfare creates self-reinforcing advantages for the imposing powers. Russian assets frozen in Western financial systems become available for seizure and redistribution to Western allies. Economic disruption in Russia creates opportunities for Western companies to capture Russian market share. Sanctions simultaneously weaken targets while strengthening the countries that impose them. Chinese officials explicitly compare American economic pressure to British Opium War tactics. When American negotiators demand Chinese policy changes in exchange for market access, Chinese strategists see updated versions of British demands for commercial concessions. The weapons are economic rather than military, but the underlying power dynamics remain identical. The weapons technology that gave Britain decisive advantages over Chinese forces, steam propulsion, iron armor, and explosive shells, were early examples of military-industrial innovation that modern defense contractors have perfected. Today's drone warfare, cyber operations, and surveillance systems provide similar asymmetric advantages over less technologically advanced opponents. American technology companies have essentially replaced the East India Company as vehicles for projecting imperial power through commercial mechanisms. Google, Facebook, Amazon, and Microsoft control global information systems while serving American intelligence agencies and foreign policy objectives. These companies provide the technological infrastructure for modern surveillance and information warfare while maintaining the appearance of commercial neutrality. Social media manipulation during political crises demonstrates how information warfare can destabilize foreign governments more effectively than military interventions. American technology companies can promote or suppress political movements in foreign countries simply by adjusting their algorithms and content moderation policies. The techniques provide plausible deniability while achieving results that would previously have required military coups. The parallels to British opium operations are striking. Both involve using superior technology to undermine foreign governmental authority while maintaining commercial justifications for activities that serve strategic objectives. Both create dependency relationships that make resistance increasingly difficult over time. Chinese efforts to develop independent technology capabilities represent attempts to avoid the technological dependency that made British economic warfare so effective during the 19th century. China's investments in semiconductor manufacturing, artificial intelligence, and telecommunications infrastructure aim to prevent repetition of historical patterns where technological inferiority led to economic subordination. American restrictions on Chinese technology access demonstrate how modern economic warfare targets technological capabilities rather than military assets. By preventing Chinese companies from accessing advanced semiconductor technology, American officials can limit Chinese economic development without military confrontation. The strategy applies British Opium War principles to contemporary conditions. Modern multinational corporations operate using organizational structures pioneered by the East India Company. They combine commercial objectives with quasi-governmental functions while maintaining legal immunity from the consequences of their activities in foreign territories. The institutional model enables systematic exploitation of vulnerable populations while avoiding accountability to any democratic government. Mining companies in Africa demonstrate how corporate colonialism continues extracting wealth from vulnerable populations using techniques perfected during the imperial period. Companies like Glencore, Rio Tinto, and Anglo-American control vast mining operations that generate billions in profits while providing minimal benefits to local populations. The operations involve corrupting local governments, displacing traditional communities, and environmental destruction that creates long-term social costs. These companies use the same legal structures that protected British opium operations: incorporation in jurisdictions with minimal oversight, complex ownership structures that obscure ultimate responsibility, and regulatory capture that ensures favorable government treatment. Modern corporate law provides even better protection for systematic exploitation than 19th century imperial charters. Agricultural companies like Cargill and Monsanto control global food systems using techniques that parallel British control over opium cultivation in India. They provide seeds, fertilizers, and financing to farmers while controlling processing and distribution networks. The system creates dependency relationships that make independent agricultural development increasingly difficult for developing countries. The results mirror British agricultural policies in India during the opium period. Traditional farming practices are abandoned in favor of export-oriented cultivation that serves corporate rather than local interests. Food security decreases, while export revenues flow to foreign corporations rather than local communities. Pharmaceutical companies continue applying these models in developing countries where regulatory oversight is minimal and legal accountability is limited. Companies can test experimental drugs, dump dangerous products, and manipulate pricing without facing meaningful consequences. The profits flow to wealthy countries, while health risks are concentrated in vulnerable populations. Modern military contractors use economic models pioneered during the Opium Wars. Private military companies like Blackwater operate similarly to the East India Company. They combine commercial objectives with military capabilities, profit from conflicts they help create, and maintain plausible deniability about their role in destabilizing foreign societies. Eric Prince, founder of Blackwater, explicitly modeled his company on the East India Company's combination of commercial and military functions. Blackwater operates private armies, intelligence networks, and logistics systems that serve both government contracts and private commercial interests. The company has been involved in military operations across Africa, Asia, and the Middle East, while maintaining corporate rather than governmental accountability. The business model is identical to that of the East India Company. Provide military services to governments while pursuing independent commercial objectives that may conflict with official policy goals. Private military contractors can engage in activities that would be politically unacceptable if conducted directly by government forces, providing plausible deniability for systematic exploitation. Wagner Group, the Russian private military company, operates using similar principles in Africa and the Middle East. The company provides military services to local governments while securing mining rights, oil concessions, and other commercial advantages for Russian corporations. Like the East India Company, Wagner combines military force with commercial extraction while maintaining distance from official Russian foreign policy. These companies demonstrate how the institutional innovations of British Opium Empire continue enabling systematic exploitation in contemporary forms. Private armies can destabilize foreign governments, control natural resources, and extract wealth while avoiding the legal constraints that limit official military operations. Modern international lending institutions use debt relationships to control foreign economic policies, using techniques that parallel British Opium War strategies. The International Monetary Fund and World Bank impose structural adjustment programs that force developing countries to adopt economic policies, serving wealthy nations' interests while claiming to provide development assistance. China's Belt and Road Initiative represents the most ambitious attempt to apply these techniques in reverse. Chinese officials offer infrastructure loans to developing countries while securing long-term access to strategic resources and transportation networks. When countries cannot repay Chinese loans, they transfer control over ports, mining rights, or other strategic assets to Chinese corporations. The model directly parallels British techniques during the opium period. British loans to weakened Asian governments created dependency relationships that justified further economic penetration and political control. Modern debt relationships achieve similar objectives through financial rather than military mechanisms. Sri Lanka's experience with Chinese debt demonstrates how the system operates in practice. China provided loans for port construction in Hambantota, while knowing that Sri Lankan revenues couldn't support repayment. When Sri Lanka defaulted, China gained 99-year control over the port facility, creating a strategic base for Chinese naval operations in the Indian Ocean. The transaction follows the British Opium Empire template perfectly. Provide financial assistance that creates dependency, then use that dependency to secure strategic concessions that serve broader imperial objectives. The weapons are economic rather than military, but the results are identical to territorial conquest. Climate change and environmental destruction represent the ultimate application of British Opium Empire techniques to contemporary conditions. Wealthy nations can devastate poorer countries through environmental policies that maximize short-term profits while imposing long-term costs on vulnerable populations. American and European fossil fuel consumption patterns impose climate costs primarily on African, Asian, and island nations that lack the technological capabilities to adapt to environmental changes. The wealthy countries that benefit from carbon emissions avoid most climate consequences, while the countries that contribute least to the problem suffer the worst effects. The dynamic mirrors British opium policies perfectly. Actions taken by powerful nations for their economic benefit impose devastating costs on powerless populations who cannot resist or retaliate effectively. The geographic separation between benefits and costs enables systematic exploitation while maintaining moral detachment from consequences. Corporate agriculture demonstrates how environmental destruction can serve imperial objectives. Companies like Cargill and Tyson Foods control global food production using techniques that exhaust soil, pollute water systems, and destroy biodiversity. The environmental costs are concentrated in developing countries while profits flow to wealthy nations. The results parallel British agricultural policies in India during the opium period. Traditional sustainable practices are replaced with export-oriented systems that serve foreign corporate interests while creating long-term environmental damage that local populations must manage. Modern surveillance technology provides capabilities that exceed anything British imperial administrators could have imagined, but the objectives remain identical. Control information flows to maintain political dominance while extracting economic benefits from subject populations. American technology companies collect personal data from billions of users worldwide, while sharing that information with American intelligence agencies and using it to manipulate political outcomes in foreign countries. The system provides American officials with unprecedented insight into foreign political developments, while creating dependency relationships that make resistance increasingly difficult. Chinese social credit systems represent attempts to apply similar techniques to domestic populations, using technologies that enable total surveillance and behavior modification. The system demonstrates how information control can achieve political compliance more effectively than physical coercion. The competition between American and Chinese surveillance systems reflects broader geopolitical struggles that parallel British and Chinese conflicts during the Opium period. Both powers seek to control global information systems while preventing competitors from achieving technological independence. Modern cultural imperialism operates through educational institutions, media systems, and cultural products that promote values serving imperial rather than local interests. American universities, entertainment companies, and cultural organizations shape global intellectual development while advancing perspectives that legitimize American dominance. The techniques parallel British cultural imperialism during the Opium period, when missionary schools and cultural institutions promoted Western values while undermining traditional knowledge systems. Modern cultural imperialism achieves similar objectives through more sophisticated methods that maintain the appearance of intellectual freedom while promoting dependency relationships. English language education demonstrates how cultural tools can serve imperial objectives. Global adoption of English provides American and British institutions with permanent advantages in international communication, education, and business. Countries that adopt English-based educational systems become dependent on Western intellectual frameworks, while their traditional knowledge systems are marginalized. Understanding these continuities doesn't require conspiracy theories or simplistic historical parallels. The same geographical advantages, technological capabilities, and institutional structures that enabled British economic dominance during the Opium period continue shaping global power relationships today. Modern resistance strategies increasingly focus on technological independence, financial diversification, and regional cooperation that reduces dependency on dominant powers. China's development of independent payment systems, Russia's creation of alternative international institutions, and various countries' efforts to reduce dollar dependence all represent attempts to escape the economic control mechanisms that Britain pioneered during the Opium period. The difference is that modern populations understand these patterns better than their 19th century predecessors. The question isn't whether powerful nations will continue using economic warfare techniques. They obviously will. The question is whether less powerful nations can develop effective resistance strategies, or whether technological and financial advantages will prove as decisive today as they were 200 years ago. Recent developments suggest that the imperial techniques pioneered during Britain's Opium Empire may be reaching their limits of effectiveness. Multiple countries are simultaneously developing alternative economic systems, independent technologies, and regional cooperation mechanisms that reduce their vulnerability to economic warfare. But history also suggests that imperial powers adapt their techniques to changing conditions rather than abandoning imperial objectives. The next phase of global economic competition may involve new forms of technological, environmental, and informational warfare that make traditional resistance strategies obsolete. The British Opium Empire established principles and techniques that continue shaping international relations today. Whether those patterns represent permanent features of global politics or historical anomalies that can be overcome through conscious effort remains the defining question of contemporary international relations. The stakes couldn't be higher. The techniques that Britain pioneered for systematic exploitation of foreign populations through commercial mechanisms have evolved into tools capable of controlling entire civilizations through environmental, technological, and financial manipulation. Understanding these patterns may be essential for human survival in an era of climate change, technological transformation, and increasing global inequality. The question isn't whether powerful institutions will continue using these techniques. They obviously will. The question is whether global populations can develop the political consciousness and organizational capabilities necessary to resist systematic exploitation by institutions that prioritize profit over human welfare, regardless of the consequences for civilization itself. When you step back and look at the full scope of what Britain accomplished between 1839 and 1860, it's difficult to find historical parallels for such systematic, profitable, and successful exploitation of foreign populations. The British Crown didn't just profit from drug trafficking, they perfected it as a tool of empire. The numbers alone tell a staggering story. Over 2 decades, British opium sales generated profits equivalent to hundreds of billions of dollars today, while creating addiction among an estimated 15 million Chinese people. That's roughly the current population of New York, Los Angeles, and Chicago combined, all systematically addicted to a foreign-controlled narcotic that their government had banned and their society desperately opposed. But the real innovation wasn't the scale of the drug trafficking. It was the legal and military framework that made systematic narcotics distribution appear legitimate. Britain transformed criminal activity into imperial policy, drug dealers into respectable merchants, and military aggression into commercial law enforcement. The template they created used superior military technology to impose commercial terms that serve your interests while devastating local populations, became the blueprint for economic warfare that continues shaping international relations today. Every time a powerful nation uses economic pressure to force policy changes in weaker countries, they're applying techniques pioneered during Britain's Opium Empire. Today, nearly 2 centuries later, China has become the world's second-largest economy and a technological competitor to the United States. Chinese leaders consistently reference the Opium Wars as formative experiences that shaped their understanding of international power relationships. The century of humiliation that began with British drug trafficking motivated the policies that transformed China into a global superpower. There's historical irony here that Chinese officials clearly appreciate. The nation that was once systematically exploited through foreign drug trafficking now manufactures most of the world's fentanyl precursors, chemicals that fuel America's opioid epidemic. Whether this represents deliberate retaliation or economic coincidence depends on your perspective, but the reversal is undeniable. The pharmaceutical companies that created America's opioid crisis used business models nearly identical to those pioneered by British opium merchants. Control the entire supply chain, minimize addiction risks in marketing while maximizing addictive potential in products, corrupt regulatory oversight, and blame users rather than suppliers when addiction problems emerge. Modern military contractors, international banks, and intelligence agencies all operate using institutional structures and legal frameworks developed during Britain's Opium Empire. The East India Company's combination of commercial objectives and military capabilities became the template for private military companies that continue operating in conflict zones worldwide.